Runaway from a brutal Mormon marriage. A cowboy hid her in his cabin and gave her real love. The snow came in sideways the night she knocked. I wasn't expecting it. Not the snow, I'd watched it building all afternoon, the way the sky goes that particular gray-green before a real storm, the color of old pewter left out. Not her either. 11 years I'd been on that patch of land up past the Uinta scrubland, and nobody knocked on my door after dark. Nobody knocked on my door much at all. I had the fire going and a pot of beans on, and the Winchester leaned against the wall beside the door, which is where I kept it. Old habit. I heard the sound and I picked it up before I answered. 3 knocks, not frantic, deliberate. That told me something. I opened the door and the cold came in around her. She was standing there with a canvas sack over one shoulder and a shawl that wasn't near enough for November in the basin. Her face, I won't say what I saw right away. I'll say what I noticed. Her lip was split, had been split recently. And she was looking at me the way a person looks at a door that might close, not a person standing in one. I stepped back and let her in. She said, I need to be somewhere they won't look. I said, sit by the fire. That was the whole conversation for a while. Her name was Cora. She told me that when her hands stopped shaking enough to hold the tin cup I gave her. Cora Fenn. She'd been Cora Aldis for 3 years, married into a settlement about 22 miles east, up in the Red Rock country where the Aldis family ran sheep and their own version of the Lord's arrangement. She didn't call it that. She used plain words, plural wife, third one. She was 28 years old and she'd walked out in the dark with one canvas sack and she wasn't going back. I am going to tell you some things about myself, so you understand what I was when she knocked on that door. My name is Del Hatcher. I was 54 years old that November. I'd been a working cowhand from the time I was 16, outfits in Colorado, Wyoming, down in the Texas Panhandle for a spell. I'd done well enough with horses and cattle that a man named Teague sold me 30 acres in the Utah Basin at a fair price when he was done with it. And I'd spent 6 years adding to it, a little at a time, until I had 83 acres and a cabin with 2 rooms and a barn that didn't leak except in the far corner. I had a roan horse named Gideon and 7 head of cattle and a kitchen garden that went hard in September. I had no wife. I'd had a woman I loved once in Wyoming and she died of a fever before we married. That was 20 years back. After that, I kept to myself. Not out of grief anymore, or not just that. After enough years alone, a man gets like a creek that's cut its own channel and runs there by habit. I wasn't unhappy. I was settled. I didn't think much about what I didn't have. That is an important thing to understand. I wasn't waiting for anything. I wasn't a lonely man looking at the horizon. I was a man with work to do and the knowledge of how to do it. Cora sat by my fire and drank beans from the cup and didn't say much. I didn't press her. I've been around animals enough to know you don't crowd something that's just come in from the cold. You let it breathe. You let it decide you're not a threat. I gave her the back room. I had a cot in there I sometimes used when my back was bad. I made it up with my spare wool blanket and an old quilt that had been my mother's, faded blue with a pattern of something, stars, maybe, or flowers. It was too worn to tell anymore. I told her the bar on the door worked from inside, and I showed her how to lift it. She looked at me when I showed her that, direct, like she was weighing something. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Hatcher." I told her to sleep. In the morning, the snow was 2 feet and still coming, which meant no one was going anywhere and no one was coming either. I made coffee and biscuits. I had a side of salt pork I'd been working through. I fried some of that. She came out of the back room with her hair down, which I don't think she'd intended, and when she saw me, she pulled it back quick with a piece of cord she had on her wrist, as though I'd caught her at something. I put the plate in front of her and poured the coffee and sat across the table and ate my own breakfast. She ate all of it. Every bite, the way a person eats when they're not sure when the next plate comes. That told me plenty. I said, "The storm'll keep. Nobody's coming through that pass before tomorrow at the earliest." She looked up. I said, "After that, we'll figure out what you need." "What I need," she said, "is to get to Salt Lake. I have a sister there." "All right. The Aldouses will be looking. Hiram, my husband, he'll send his brothers." "How many brothers?" "4. I nodded and drank my coffee. "They're not good men," she said. "I want you to know that plainly. I don't want you hurt on account of me." I looked at her then. The split lip had a bruise around it, purple-yellow, a couple of days old. There was another mark at her jaw, older than that. I said, I'm hard to hurt. She looked at me a moment, then she looked back down at her plate. You don't know Hiram. No, I said, but I know the type. The snow kept us in for 3 days. I won't make it into something it wasn't. It was 3 days of 2 people in a small cabin finding the edges of each other's company. She was quiet in the mornings. She washed her own dishes without being asked. She found my mending pile on the 2nd day. I had a stack of it, shirts and a pair of trousers I'd been putting off, and she mended it all without a word, sitting by the window with my kit, her hands moving fast and sure. I told her she didn't have to do that. She said, I know. And she kept on. I went out twice a day to see to the cattle and Gideon, and to check the road. The road was buried. On the afternoon of the 2nd day, I climbed to the ridge that looked east, the way she'd come, and I glassed the country with my field glasses. Nothing moving out there but a raven. I fixed a loose board on the barn floor. I sharpened my knives. In the evenings I read. I keep books, always have. It embarrasses some men to admit that, but I don't care, and she asked me once what I was reading. I told her it was Gibbon. She said she'd read it. I said I wouldn't have guessed that. She gave me a look that was the first thing that was close to humor and said women in plural marriages had plenty of time to read. It was one of the few things nobody could regulate. Something about the way she said that, dry as the flats in August. That was when I started to see her whole. She wasn't fragile. I thought she was that first night, the shawl, the bloody lip, the way she stood at the door. But that wasn't fragile. That was used up. There's a difference. A fragile thing breaks under pressure. Something used up just needs to be left alone long enough to remember its whole. On the 3rd night, the temperature dropped hard and the fire needed feeding through the night. I was up twice. The 2nd time I came in from the wood pile, she was already up, had the fire stoked, was standing in her stockings in the firelight with her arms folded, looking at the flames. She said I couldn't sleep. I set down the wood and said nothing. I put the kettle on. She said, Did you ever have a family, Mr. Hatcher? I told her about Wyoming, about the woman I'd loved and lost. I told it plain, no embellishment, no drama, just the facts of it. The fever, the 3 days, the end. She listened. When I finished, she said, I'm sorry. I said, it was a long time ago. It doesn't always get smaller, she said. Some things just stay the size they are. We drank tea until the fire steadied. Then she went back to the room, and I lay down on my cot by the hearth and looked at the ceiling for a while. On the 4th morning, the road was passable. I knew before I looked. The wind had changed in the night, that particular silence that comes when a storm breaks. I'd lived in the basin long enough to feel it in my sleep. Over breakfast, I told her I could take her as far as Moab in the wagon, and from Moab she could get a stage to Salt Lake. 3 days' travel if the roads held. She said, what about the Aldhouses? I said, what about them? If they come looking hereafter, they'll make trouble for you. I poured my coffee. Let me worry about that. She studied me. She did that, looked at a person like she was reading a passage, and intended to understand it fully before she turned the page. Why are you helping me? She said. I thought about that, not because I didn't know, but because I wanted to say it right. Because you knocked, I said, and because it's the right thing. She kept looking at me. Then she nodded once like she was settling something in her own mind. We loaded the wagon after breakfast. I put the Winchester under the bench seat. I put a 2nd blanket in the bed of the wagon and a tin of biscuits and a jar of water. I harnessed Gideon and checked his shoes. The left forefoot had been bothering me, and I packed it with pine tar before we started. She stood and watched me work. I wasn't aware of it at first, then I was. When I straightened up, she said, You're careful. I said, About horses, yes. About everything, she said. I didn't know what to say to that, so I held out my hand to help her up to the bench. She took it. Her hand was cold and strong. We made 7 miles before we saw them. 4 riders coming down from the east, from the direction of the Red Rock country. They were moving with purpose, not men out looking at winter range, men following a track. They spread out a little when they saw the wagon. That's a thing men do when they mean to stop you. I pulled Gideon to a halt, and I reached under the bench for the Winchester without making a show of it. I laid it across my knees. Beside me, I felt Cora go very still, not the stillness of fear, the stillness of someone who has made a decision and is waiting to see how it plays out. The riders came up. The lead one was young, maybe 35, black beard going gray at the sides, eyes set too close. He looked at Cora, then at me. "That's my brother's wife," he said. I said, "That's a woman in my wagon. She's Cora Aldis, Hiram Aldis's wife. She ran off 4 nights ago, and we've been tracking her." I kept my voice flat. She told me a different story. He looked at me harder. "I don't know you." "No," I said, "you don't. Give her over, and there won't be any trouble." I lifted the Winchester. Not fast, not threatening, just lifted it so it lay across both my forearms with the barrel pointed off to his left. A man with experience reads that correctly. This man had experience. "There's already trouble," I said. "The question is which direction it goes." He looked at the rifle. He looked at his brothers, 3 of them fanned out behind him, then back at me. I said, "I don't know what arrangement she had with your family. I know what I see in front of me. I'm going to take this woman to Moab and see her onto a stage. You're going to ride back the way you came. You got no authority here." I got the Winchester. Silence. Wind, a long moment. "Hiram will hear about you," the bearded man said. "Write it down so you remember my name," I said. "Del Hatcher, 83 acres off the Basin Road. Tell Hiram to come see me himself if he's got business." I said it because I meant it, not bravado. Men like Hiram Aldis send their brothers. They don't come themselves, and if he came himself, I'd deal with that then. The bearded man sat his horse another moment. Then he turned, and the brothers turned with him, and they rode back east. I didn't lower the Winchester until they were a 1/4 mile gone. Beside me, Cora let out a breath. Long and slow, like she'd been holding it since the night she walked out. She said, "You didn't have to say your name." "No," I said. "You gave him something to come back with." "I know." She looked at me. I was watching the riders go, but I felt her looking. "Why?" she said. "Because I meant what I said. 83 acres, Basin Road. I'm not hard to find, and I'm not hiding from Hiram Aldis or his brothers." I clicked to Gideon, and we started moving again. Now he knows that, too. Another silence. Then she said, "You're not afraid of them." "Didn't say that." "You're not, though." I drove. The road curved south, away from the rock country, into the lower basin where the sage flats opened up wide and gray-brown under the winter sky. "I've been afraid of things," I said. "Losing the ranch, losing Gideon, getting old and useless." I glanced at her. "Not of men like that, not for a long time." She nodded. She was looking at the road ahead. After a while she said, quietly, so I almost didn't catch it over the wagon noise, "You're a different kind of man than I've known." I didn't say anything. I wasn't sure it needed an answer. We made camp that night in the lee of a sandstone shelf where the wind couldn't reach us. I built a fire and hobbled Gideon and cooked the last of the salt pork with some dried corn I'd brought. She made the biscuits from the tin into something passable by holding them near the flame on a flat rock. We ate and didn't talk much. The cold was serious and we sat close to the fire. After a while she leaned back against the sandstone and looked at the sky. She said, "Tell me about your 83 acres. So I told her, the creek that came down from the ridge in spring, the flat ground south of the barn that would take a kitchen garden if a person put the work in. The way the light hit in October, slant and gold, and how it made even the scrub look like something worth looking at. The cattle, Gideon." She listened, all of it. When I finished, she said, "It sounds like enough." "It is," I said. "It's more than enough." She was quiet a moment. Then, "I used to think about a place like that, before Hiram, before all of it." A pause. "My sister wrote me that Salt Lake is different, that a woman can find work there. Teaching, maybe." "I taught before." "What did you teach?" "Reading, numbers, history." Her voice was careful. "Children." I nodded. "I was good at it," she said. "No apology in it, just a plain fact." "I believe you," I said. She looked at me then. The firelight was orange on her face. The bruise had faded some more, was going yellow at the edges now. She said, "Do you think Hiram will come, actually come?" I thought about it honestly. "No," I said. "Men like Hiram only move when they think they'll win. I don't think he's sure about that." "And if he is?" "Then he comes, and we deal with it." "We," she said. I hadn't meant to say it that way. Or maybe I had and wasn't ready to own it. "You're a guest on my land," I said. Hospitality runs for a while. She looked at me a long time. Long enough that I got a little uncomfortable, which didn't happen to me often. Then she said, Dell. First time she'd used my name, not Mr. Hatcher, Dell. Yes, I said. Thank you, she said it simple, the way people say things they've been carrying a while and finally set down. Not just for today, for the door, for the room, for all of it. I looked into the fire. You knocked, I said. That's all it was. No, she said, it wasn't. Moab was another 2 days. I won't stretch it out. Roads were rough and cold. Gideon threw a shoe on the morning of the second day, and I pulled over and replaced it. I carried spare shoes and the tools for it, always did. And she held Gideon's head while I worked and talked to him low and steady while he shifted, the way you'd talk to a skittish child. He settled. She had good hands with animals. I noticed that. We talked more, less careful than the first day. She told me about Ohio, where she'd grown up, and her father's farm. She told me about the husband she'd had before Hiram, a young man, dead of a riding accident before they'd had a year together. That was when the Aldous men had found her, a young widow with no family near, and made their arrangement look like salvation. I listened, I didn't say much. Some stories need a listener more than they need a response. She told me about the children she'd taught before Hiram took that from her too. Third wife gets no school, he'd told her. Third wife tends house and doesn't go into town except with an escort. She said it without bitterness, just fact, but the facts themselves were bitter enough. I said, you're going to teach again. She looked at me a little surprised. You said you were good at it, I said. Salt Lake needs teachers. A woman who's good at something finds a way to do it. She was quiet, then, you sound sure. I am sure. Why? I kept my eyes on the road. Because you walked 22 miles in the dark in November with a canvas sack, I said. A woman who does that finds a way. A long silence. When I looked over, she was looking away out at the Sage Flats. Her jaw was set. I thought maybe I'd said something wrong. Then I realized her eyes were bright, not crying, close. She didn't want me to see it, so I looked at the road. Moab was a real town by then, a main street, a hotel, a mercantile, a stage depot. I drove her to the depot and got down and tied Gideon and went inside with her. The next stage to Salt Lake was in 2 days. 2 days was a problem. She had money, not much, coins she'd sewn into the lining of the canvas sack. Enough for the stage ticket, but not much for a hotel room and meals on top of it. I didn't say anything about the money. I went to the counter and paid for her room at the hotel down the street. She saw me do it. When we came back outside, she said, I'll pay you back. You don't need to. Dell. Cora, I said it firm enough that she stopped. It's $30. I've got $30. Let it be. She stood in the cold street and looked at me. She had her canvas sack over her shoulder and her shawl, and she looked cold and worn and entirely herself. I don't know how to accept things, she said. I know, I said. Start small. Something shifted in her face. That almost humor again, the dry thing that was really her underneath everything that had been piled on top. She said, I'll send it back when I'm settled. You don't have to. I know that too. I nodded. I untied Gideon. She said, will you come into town before the stage goes? I looked at her. She was watching me steadily, something direct and plain in it, nothing complicated. I could do that, I said. I found lodgings for Gideon at the livery and took a room at the hotel myself. The next 2 days were the strangest of that stretch. We were just 2 people in a town, eating at the same table at the hotel dining room, walking the street in the afternoon, no urgency, nowhere to be. She bought a pair of gloves at the mercantile. Good ones, leather, she'd been without since she left. I watched her try them on at the counter, working her fingers into the leather, flexing her hands. She paid for them herself. I found a bookshop on the 2nd Street, a real one with crates of books outside, and spent an hour in there. She came with me. We didn't talk much. Just moved through the crates. She pulled out a history of Rome and showed it to me, a different Gibbon, a volume I didn't have. I bought it. She found a worn novel she didn't tell me the title of and bought it for herself. That evening at dinner she said, tell me what you're going to do when you get back. Winter work, I said. Fix the fence line on the south pasture. It went down in October and I've been putting it off. By yourself. Always have. She broke a piece of bread. You must get lonely. I thought about it honestly. Sometimes, I said, not the way people think, not like I'm missing a thing, more like the quiet gets heavy sometimes. She nodded. The quiet at the settlement was heavy that way, only it wasn't really quiet, it was full of noise. It just wasn't any kind of noise that meant anything. I understood that, I said so. You know what I missed most, she said. Someone to talk to, not conversation, not news and weather, just someone to talk to, someone where the words go somewhere. She was looking at her plate when she said it, not at me. I said, I know what you mean. She looked up. The words go somewhere, I said. That's exactly it. We looked at each other a moment, across the table. The dining room was warm and loud with other people's conversations, and neither of us was paying any attention to any of it. The morning of the stage, she was down before me. I found her in the hotel lobby with her sack and her new gloves, looking at the street through the glass of the door. I said, stage won't be here for 2 hours. I know, she said. I don't sleep well before a thing. We had breakfast. She wasn't hungry, just drank coffee. I ate. We didn't talk much. When the time came, I walked her out to the stage depot. The coach was already there, horses being changed out, the driver up top with the luggage. A few other passengers milled around. She had her ticket, she had her sack, she had her new gloves, which she was wearing. We stood on the board sidewalk in the cold morning light. She said, if Hiram comes. He's not coming, I said, but if he does, I'm ready. You're sure? Yes. She looked at me, studying, that careful reading she did. Then she reached out and put her hand on my chest, palm flat through my coat, just resting there. She looked up at me. She said, I'm going to write to you. I said, all right. I mean it. I know you do. She left her hand there a moment. Then she said, quiet, like she was finishing a thought she'd been working on for 3 days. There are men who take things, there are men who don't see you at all, and then there is whatever you are, Del Hatcher. She looked me in the eye. I've been thinking about what to call it. I think it's just a good man. I think that's all it is. She took her hand back. She picked up her sack. I felt the place where her hand had been, even through the coat, even in the cold. I said, take care of yourself. I will, she said. She stepped off the sidewalk toward the coach. Then she stopped and turned back. The south pasture fence. How long will it take? I didn't know why she was asking. Week, maybe 2, why? She looked at me, that direct, full look, reading to the end of the page. I'm going to write to my sister first, she said, and then I'm going to write to you. You said that? I said I'd write. I didn't say what I was going to say. She held my eye. Don't fix the fence alone, wait a week or 2. I looked at her. She nodded once, that particular nod of hers, like settling something, and then she walked to the coach, and the driver handed her up and the door closed. I stood on that sidewalk until the coach was gone around the corner, until I couldn't hear the horses anymore. Then I went and got Gideon from the livery and started the ride home. The letter came on a Thursday. I know because Thursday is when Walt Prout comes by from the post road and leaves whatever there is. Usually nothing, sometimes a catalog. That Thursday he came to the barn door where I was oiling tack and held out an envelope and said, "Woman's writing," like it was news. I waited until he left before I opened it. I won't repeat what she wrote. Some things keep their weight by being kept. I'll say she had found her sister, found a room, found a position at a school on the east side of the city. She said the children were loud and she was glad of it. She said the city was too big and not enough sky. She said she thought about the 83 acres. At the bottom she said, "Is the fence done?" I wrote back, "Not yet." Her next letter came 10 days later. In March she came back. Not on the stage. She came in a hired wagon with her sister's husband driving, a quiet man named Thomas who shook my hand and didn't ask many questions. She had 2 trunks this time, not a canvas sack. It was a clear, cold morning, and I was at the fence line. I want you to know that I had actually fixed the fence. The question she'd asked was about something else, and we both knew it. But I was out there checking it when they came down the Basin Road, and I saw the wagon from a ways off, and I knew. I put down my tools and walked back to the yard. She climbed down before Thomas had even stopped fully, her new gloves, a coat that fit her. She walked across the yard to where I was standing and she stopped in front of me. She looked at me the way she had at the stage depot. That full reading look. She said, I told my sister I was coming back to the basin. She said I was a fool. Are you? No, she said it flat and certain. She doesn't know what's here. I looked at her, whined off the ridge the cold and clean smell of it, Gideon in the corral shifting his feet. I said, what is here? She reached up and put her hand on my jaw the way she'd put it on my chest at the depot, palm flat, steady. She looked me in the eye. Enough, she said, more than enough. I put my hand over hers. Her fingers were cold. I held them warm. Thomas turned the wagon around and gave us our privacy, and we stood like that a while in the yard, the wind going past us, the sky wide and pale blue and enormous over the basin, and I was not a man waiting for anything anymore. I was a man who had what he needed right there in my hand. She stayed. That spring I put in the kitchen garden. She worked it beside me. In the evenings she read her novel and I read Gibbon, and the fire went low and the quiet was the right kind of quiet, the kind that has a person in it. Some nights I'd look across at her in the lamplight and I'd think about the man I was before she knocked on that door. The settled, channeled man running his worn rut. I didn't regret that man. He was who I was. But I knew what he'd been missing and he hadn't known it himself, which is the particular blindness of solitude. It shows you only what you have, never what you don't. She knew what she'd been missing. She'd walked 22 miles in the dark through November to find something different, and she'd found it at a door she knocked on by luck and nerve, and the plain will to live as herself. One evening in April, she set down her book and looked at me and said, "You know what I think of sometimes." I looked up. "That night at the stage," she said, "what I said. I remember it. You didn't say anything back." "I know." She looked at me, waiting. I closed my book. "A good man," I said. "You said a good man, that's all." I looked at her across the lamplight. I'd been a long time without anyone thinking that, without anyone knowing me well enough to think it. I paused. "You said it like it was enough, like it was plenty, like it was the whole thing." She nodded. "It is," she said. Outside, the wind was down. The basin was quiet in the way it gets in spring, soft, alive, the creek running somewhere below the ridge. The lamp threw a small, warm circle, and we were both in it. I didn't need anything else.